This takes us to our first section this week, Imperial China Collapses. This is chapter 30, section 3. We have 3 objectives. First, list the problems the new Republic of China faced. So we're going to look at problems of a new republic. Second, trace the rise of communism in China. So it's to be clear that China did not shift exactly from imperial China to communism. There was a rise of communism. And third, describe the civil war between the communists and the nationalists. Now, the last dynasty in China is the Qing dynasty. What ends up happening is this dynasty ends up getting overthrown, and we have sort of a new power coming into play. This party is called the Kuomintang. Now, you would be familiar with what the Kuomintang is. We have a Kuomintang party in Taiwan. It means it's the nationalist party of China. And the nationalist party calls for modernization. Now, at the head of this party is Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen is the first great leader of the Nationalist Party. And in 1911, he is part of the nationalists who overthrow the Qing dynasty. Now remember, when we think of nationalism, we've had some past nationalist groups shift into fascism. So fascism is sort of an extreme idea of nationalism. Now, that doesn't ever quite happen in China because we have nationalists battling it out with communists. So the nationalists, when they overthrow the Qing dynasty, it starts off very shaky. What that means is that the government is not a strong government after the dynasty is overthrown. So in 1912, we have Sun Yat-sen. He takes control. He becomes the president. And he is trying to build China on 3 basic principles: the principle of nationalism, democracy, and economic security. The problem is that Sun is not a very good leader. This is Sun here. We can see him right here. So he is good at revolution. He has some very noble ideas on how China should run under democracy. But he is not able to be a strong leader that China needs. So what ends up happening is we have another man sort of takes over the presidency, and his name is Yuan Shikai. He is given the presidency, and even though at first he claims that he is going to promote nationalism, democracy, and economic security, he goes against democracy. So what ends up happening is there's no national agreement on rule, and we have civil wars breaking out. So China is already starting a war over whether China should be a democratic country or not. This brings us to World War I. Now, we studied World War I in focusing on Europe and North America. But China had a role in World War I as well. China is actually entering World War I against Germany. They're hoping that if they help the Allied powers, that many of the colonies that were taken from China by Germany would be given back to China. But what ends up happening? The Treaty of Versailles. Now, we already know there are many issues with the Treaty of Versailles. But one thing that the Treaty of Versailles states is that all these German colonies that are in China, they aren't given back to the Chinese, they're actually given to the Japanese. This upsets Chinese. This especially upsets the Chinese students. So in May 4, in 1919, we have students are going against the government and against sort of a national outcry over the Treaty of Versailles. This is called the May 4th movement. The nationalist movement ends up spreading across China. But many of these young nationalists, they start turning against Sun Xian and start thinking that Lenin's style of communism is going to be a better fit for China. So one of the causes of communism starting to become popular in China is the Treaty of Versailles. So here we have some images of this May movement. Many of the students are walking around with different flags. This brings us to a very important leader in the 20th century, Mao. Now, it's important to note that Mao was not necessarily a leader at first. He was actually working in a library where he started to develop a new sort of idea with communism. Now, this communism would be different than what Lenin was doing in Russia. Lenin organized communism around Russia's major cities. What Mao wanted to do was he was trying to bring a communist revolution to the rural peasants. Now imagine how large China is. Mao is sort of thinking that if he can sort of gain the support of many of these peasants in the countryside, that is the way that communism will function well in China. Now going back to that first leader, Sun Yat-sen, he is a nationalist group, but he quickly starts to become sort of disillusioned by democracy and Western-style policy. So he ends up actually wanting the Kuomintang to match with the newly formed Communist Party. When Lenin sees that this is starting to happen in China, he starts to befriend China as well. He wants to help these nationalists who are thinking of sort of shifting their ideas to communism. He sends different military advisors, and he also sends supplies to this nationalist group. The communists ends up joining with the nationalists. If you don't remember who Lenin is, he was sort of started one of the communist revolutions in Russia also in 1919. Once Sun Yat-sen dies, we have another sort of leader of the nationalist group rising up. His name is Jiang Jieshi. In many Western countries, we have called him Shanghai Shek, which for the purpose of my pronunciation, that's how I will refer to him. So Jiang Jieshi, he is a nationalist leader, and he opposes communism. He is fearful of sort of this socialist motive, and he's also fearful of Russia. But Jiang's government is less and less democratic. So even though he says that he's promoting democracy in China, it becomes quite corrupt. Many of the peasants in the rural countryside, they are seeing this. They're seeing that the government is corrupt, and so they start to back the Communist Party. Jiang Jieshi realizes, though, he needs the communists to sort of get some of these warlords out of the north. So for a bit, the nationalists and the communists are working together in China. Once these northern warlords are sort of wiped out, that is when Jiang sort of turns against the communists. So in 1927, we have nationalists are killing many communist leaders in the area of Shanghai. Now the US and Britain, they're very happy about this, since at this point they don't like the idea of communism. But we have the Soviet Union, they're quite upset about that this has happened. A year later, in 1928, we have Jiang is becoming the president. But this results in civil war, as the communists do not recognize his rule. By 1930, we have a civil war in China. We have the nationalists, which is Jiang, versus the communists, which is Mao. Now, Mao has sort of a plan. He is recruiting many peasants to be a part of his army. And Mao's warfare is what we call guerrilla warfare. That means it's not fought on a battlefield. It's sort of fought as surprise attacking the others. This lends to what we call the Long March. Now, in 1933, Jiang surrounds the area where the communists are. It's a sort of a mountainous area. The communists realize that they have not many options. And so what they start to do is they start the Long March. What the Long March is, they're taking their whole army through many mountainous landscapes through the countryside, and they're trying to stay just one step ahead of Jiang's huge army. This is a journey of 6,000 miles, and it almost crosses a good chunk of China. They start with 100,000 communist soldiers, and by the end of 1 year, we only have about 7,000 or 8,000 left. So we have almost 93 or 92,000 people die during this long march. Now, this is below. This is actually Mao on a horse, and as you can see, they are marching. Now, marching, that means a 6,000-mile walk across China. This is sort of an indication of the Long March. Okay, so we're starting in more the southern area. It's sort of zipping around, and then it goes up through the north. So if you can imagine how big China is, this is quite a long march. What ends up happening, though, and what puts a stop to the Civil War, is the fact that Japan launches their invasion. So in 1937, this is something we've already learned about. We have Japan is seeing that China is sort of weak from this fight between nationalists and communists. So the nationalists and communists, they have no choice but to join together to fight against Japan. This brings me to my question. My first question of the week is, do you think that Jiang Jixi or Shanghai Shek could have done anything else to avoid a civil war in China? And please tell me what he could have done. Your second question of the week is, if you think that the Long March had failed and that Jiang's army had caught up with Mao, do you think that today China would have been communist? Please tell me why you think that.